smoky, oily, greasy, smoggy, smoggy, smoky, oily, greasy. Have you met the smoggies?
Special filtering bunny masks are the latest weapons devised to combat smog, which last winter killed 4,000 Londoners in a single week. Dogs as well can be protected against the deadly fumes which throw a heavy pall across Britain's big cities every year.
The nation's largest city muffles 10 of its buses and air pollution at the same time.
Motorcycle police tried masks while the city launched its biggest, most desperate smog investigation.
Los Angeles smog has always intrigued the amateur inventor. One of the first suggestions, and it is constantly being repeated, is that giant fans be mounted on the rim of the basin. Fans that would blow the pollution away. Unfortunately, there isn't enough electrical energy in the world to propel those fans, and if there were, the concentrated smog that they would push out would kill every living thing in its path.
Next, I want to talk about air pollution. Now, you probably think you know air pollution, visible air pollution, smokestacks, smog, and the like. So this week, I want to take you on a journey towards something I think you won't know about, something that outlines the grave, yet very hidden dangers of invisible air pollution. And this story all starts with one man.
What about this? Which human being in history has done the most damage to the environment? Alan.
George Bush.
No.
Stalin. Genghis Khan. Mao Zedong. Margaret Beckett.
Not Margaret Beckett. We can give you his birth year, 1889. Yes.
Oh, no, it's not going to be Henry Ford, then.
No.
No, OK.
No.
Diesel. Mr. Diesel.
No.
Again, I'm losing points fast.
No, you don't lose. You only lose points if there's a...
right, OK.
Because you said something obvious.
Right. Mr. Chrysler.
No.
No, sorry.
It's not... If I tell you his
Henry
name...
Rolls.
I'll tell you his name.
William Royce.
I'll tell you his name.
Go on, then.
Thomas Midgley.
Thomas Midgley.
He discovered by chance that iodine added to kerosene reduced knocking in cars. So he decided that, although it slightly reduced it, slightly wasn't enough. He wanted to completely reduce it. So he tried every single chemical in the periodic table until he came up with lead. And as a result, all motor cars for 70-odd years put lead in their petrol.
On a typical day last month, U.S. motorists used 122 million gallons of leaded gasoline. What comes from leaded exhaust is a polluted atmosphere and damage to children, like brain damage, learning disabilities. Estimates? 300,000 children have levels of lead in their systems that are considered dangerous.
Do you remember buying leaded gasoline?
Oh, certainly. Absolutely.
They were having gas wars, 25 cents a gallon in 1971, 2? When did I start driving?
I remember leaded gasoline. Lead in the gas was anti-knock compound and something else that protected valves, maybe? I can't remember.
It was a valve sealant, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why it was in.
Do you remember that they used to have leaded and unleaded where you could pick which gas you wanted? Until
when leaded was still around, when cars still needed it. Yeah, they sold leaded gas for quite some time.
Yeah.
After when leaded came out. But, I remember gas pumps that contains lead. Right on it. I know when I was buying gas for like my motorcycle when I was a kid, that certainly was leaded gas, because that would have been late 60s, early 70s. I'm guessing now. I don't think I really paid much attention. I had 50 cents in my pocket and I needed a couple gallons of gas.
I mean, so here's the wild thing, and that's why I'm picking this particular story this week to teach the students about. So the ethyl lead, which is the compound that makes leaded gasoline leaded, was invented by this guy named Thomas Midgley, and he's noted for being potentially, perhaps, the person who has created the most environmental harm on the planet than anyone else who's ever lived.
Oh, why?
And so he was hired by Standard Oil to develop anti-knock formulations for their fuel, right? And what he ultimately did is tried every compound on the periodic table until he discovered that lead was working really good. And so then Standard Oil kind of went on this campaign to sell people on, if you buy the leaded gasoline, ethyl gas, right? They didn't use the word lead. That's the other thing, right? It
called ethyl.
It got advertised as ethyl.
I don't know.
And that's why ethyl gasoline brings out the full power and performance of your car.
Ethyl anti-knock compound raises the octane number of gasoline and makes it possible for motorists to get the maximum driving power out of their fuel.
So why don't you do what I do? Fill up wherever you see this famous ethyl emblem. There's a powerful difference. Take it from me, Mel Allen.
So Standard Oil marketed this product as ethyl gas, and it's because it contained tetraethyl lead. And we knew that lead was bad, right? I mean, we've known that for a long time. Lead has sort of health implications for all of us. So they didn't want to use the word lead. So anyway, it got marketed as ethyl gas. And later on, like they started finding the people who were working at the refineries that were sort of blending ethyl gasoline, they went insane. And like, I don't use that word lightly, like they clinically went insane, because like one of the side effects of lead poisoning is that it like manipulates your brain, right? So they start having hallucinations and stuff, right? And so so tons of people were dying at these production facilities that were blending leaded gasoline. And Thomas Midgley himself was poisoned by lead. And in 1920, General Motors and Standard Oil started adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline. Workers blending ethyl lead at refineries got sick, went insane, and 17 of them died from lead poisoning. Midgley himself would succumb to lead poisoning after he staged an elaborate demonstration to confront rumors that ethyl lead was dangerous by pouring it all over his hands and under his nose. He would never report it, but it took him nearly a year to recover from the ensuing poisoning of that publicity stunt. It wouldn't be until decades later that the full impact of leaded gasoline would be revealed, when Claire Patterson, a scientist trying to solve the problem of the age of the Earth, noticed that atmospheric lead isotopes in his ice core samples from the last few decades were incredibly high. Curiously, he was able to date the increase in lead precisely to the adoption of ethyl gasoline. Patterson went on to sample lead levels in bones of cadavers, as well as 4,500-year-old Peruvian individuals and one 2,200-year-old Egyptian mummy. He showed that samples taken from modern Americans contained 600 times more lead than those from the ancient remains. In 1976, the newly formed EPA would begin restricting use of lead in gasoline, but wouldn't fully ban it until 1995. By then, the damage was already done. Lead is widely understood to be highly toxic to multiple organs of the body, particularly the brain. Individuals exposed to lead at young ages are more vulnerable to learning disabilities, decreased IQ, attention deficit disorder, and problems with impulse control, all of which may be negatively impacting decision making. No safe level of lead exists in the human bloodstream. And with the advent of things like leaded gasoline, the exposure of children to lead from the 1940s to the 1970s soared. This led to one really important consequence.
After World War II, crime rates slowly but drastically increased in the United States. Theft, larceny, violent crime almost quadrupled since the 1970s. But in the 1990s, that trend reversed suddenly. Across the board, in every category you might imagine, crime rates plummeted and have continued to decrease. There have been numerous explanations proposed for this abrupt reversal, but one theory paints a particularly dramatic picture of the event, with profound implications. As they grow, children exposed to lead tend to have issues with inhibition and emotional regulation, which can manifest as social aggression. They're at increased risk for attention disorders, which might be part of why they have lower IQs. There's evidence showing correlations between childhood lead exposure and a whole slew of negative life outcomes, things like substance abuse problems and poor performance at work. Obviously, there's a great deal of variance in the ultimate result, but there's a massive body of research suggesting that exposing children to trace amounts of lead can be disastrous. Prior to legislation like the Lead-Based Poisoning Prevention Act of 1971, lead was used in many places which would subject children to its many neurological effects. Paints, furniture, and most notably leaded gasoline, which was great for engine performance and efficiency, flooded the environment with lead. We can test for lifetime lead exposure by examining bone marrow, and sure enough, people who grew up during those years where lead was prevalent, especially people from dense urban environments with lots of cars and apartment complexes with tons of lead-based paint, have a higher concentration of lead in their bones than children born a generation after the legislation went into effect. It starts to seem plausible that the decades-long trend we saw in crime might be due, at least in part, to the effect of lead exposure on children's brains. Some researchers have argued that lead exposure is the largest part of the rise and fall of crime rates between the 70s and the 90s. By some estimates, it accounts for as much as 90% of the variance. The thought that simply adding lead to our gas may have resulted in decades of suffering, that the whole nation's average IQ was lowered by a few points, that a huge number of people who would have otherwise been responsible citizens became criminals solely because they were poisoned as babies. It's a big idea.
And in case that wasn't enough, Midgley's story doesn't just end right here. After the success of ethyl lead, Midgley turned his attention to creating a better refrigerant, one that would be safe, non-flammable, and free of toxicity. What he found was dichloromethane, the first commercial CFC. He called it Freon. It was so wildly successful, so completely non-toxic, that it was used in hundreds of ways. Air conditioners, refrigerators, hairspray, aerosol cans, even asthma inhalers. Virtually anywhere you needed an inert gas, CFCs could be found.
Some think it was his guilt about that led him to think of doing something about their nasty old sulfur dioxide and the nasty old ammonia that were used in refrigeration. So he discovered in 3 days dichlorofluoromethane. Fantastic. He was very proud of that because it's inert, it's non-toxic, it's beneficial, the first of the freons. What did he not know it was also doing?
Destroying the ozone layer.
Destroying the ozone layer.
It's a card, isn't it?
Not content with thousands and hundreds of millions of tons of lead.
What's his next trick?
It wouldn't be until 1973 when chemist Frank Rowland and Mario Molina noticed the impact that all of these inert CFC molecules were having on our protective ozone layer. A year later, these scientists would testify before Congress. And by 1982, CFCs were beginning to be banned internationally. And pictures from space of gaping holes in our atmosphere's protective layer would cause us to react with horror. But Thomas Midgley wouldn't be around to see these effects.
He's put lead in petrol, he's invented CFCs, but then he was struck by polio at the age of 51.
Oh, f***ing good!
It gets better. He invented for himself a harness because he was crippled by polio to get himself in and out of bed. One morning, it swung around a little bit oddly, and in the ensuing struggle, he strangled himself to death.
Hoisted
by his own petard, age 55. That's Thomas Midgley, the man who's done more damage than anybody else.
This might seem a fitting end for a man who made such great and yet devastatingly terrible scientific contributions, with his most ingenious inventions leading to some of the most horrifying environmental outcomes. Will progress and innovation always lead to negative environmental outcomes? I want to invite you to think about the impact of not being able to know the outcome of our own actions. Do you think we would be better off without his contributions? Finally, there's a lesson to be learned from all of this. 1, there are great dangers in invisible air pollution. Lead and CFCs are some of the most significant invisible air pollutants we've ever known. 2, unintended consequences. The outcomes of our actions can be unpredictable. No one could have predicted that Midgley's ingenious solutions to anti-knock gasoline and non-toxic refrigerants could have had the lasting effects that they did. 3. Collateral damage. Lead poisoning became a prime example of collateral environmental damage. Even if we were prepared to release lead into the environment, we were probably not prepared for the lasting effects of lead poisoning on our children. And last, the restorative power of corrective action. Banning lead in gasoline and CFCs were shown to reverse the negative effects.
Upper atmosphere of Earth contains ozone that absorbs radiation away. Shields back photons, it plays a key role. From O2 endo, 105 kg per mole. CFC molecules collide.